Welcome to Good Life. I'm Dean Wilson. Great program today. James Joyce is with me. He's a businessman, entrepreneur. He's been in journalism. He's been in public service. He's a fascinating guy. You're really going to enjoy it. Stay tuned. James Joyce, The Good Life is next. Welcome to Good Life. I'm Dean Wilson. So glad you've joined us. From wherever you are, you can always find us at goodlifetelevision.org. We're so grateful for so many of you joining us there from all around the world. I think like 100 countries in the last year. It's fantastic, so welcome. Goodlifetelevision.org is where you can find all the episodes as well as power clips where we kind of break down those episodes into moments that you'll like. And also Good Life Conversations podcast is up. And we've just launched over the last month, and we're really excited about the response. So you can always find us. It's at all the platforms, Spotify and all the other ones. So Good Life Conversations is the name of the podcast. And we're so glad you're with us. I'm so excited about my guest today. James Joyce is with me. James, welcome.
Hello, how are you?
Good. James is a businessman, entrepreneur. He's been a journalist. He's been in public service, working as a director for State Senator Hannah Beth Jackson, which represents about 1 million or so constituents here in the area where we're sitting, which is Santa Barbara, California. James has had a number of involvements with boards and different foundations and organizations, so he's got a really diverse background. I was going to first ask you about that. How did you kind of end up with this resume that's kind of a mile wide as far as your areas of involvement?
An accident. You just kind of stumble into things, and that's kind of been my mode for most of my life, right? When I was in college, I started as a student athlete, and most student athletes, that's enough, right?
Right.
Well, nope, not for me. I got involved in organizations and had meetings, and then became an RA, and then worked for the newspaper. Just always been involved in stuff, right?
Huh.
And so that's just been part of who I've been as a youth and into adulthood as well.
And take us back to your youth. You grew up in Westminster, Maryland,
Yes, sir.
which is I think about 30 minutes from Baltimore. So
Yep.
tell us kind of what your upbringing was like and where you came from.
So Westminster is an interesting place. It's I later found that there's a Confederate general buried in a cemetery there.
Really?
The cemetery I walked past every day to go to middle school, but didn't know it until, of course, I was older. But learning about the history of Westminster, I mean, it was basically the holdup that allowed the Battle of Gettysburg to be won. There was a battle in Westminster.
Huh.
And so that there was just, knowing that there's this old school history, old school architecture. I mean, it's East Coast, but it's predominantly white, right? Predominantly conservative. In middle school, I ended up wearing cornrows, and that was a very risque thing in town, right?
Really?
And so, it was an interesting place to grow up. But there are areas of town where, my family, friends were, and we just kind of hung out, had a good time. I mean, it wasn't like it was dangerous or rough per se. I guess the only negative thing was my high school was termed Heroin High because there had been back in the late 90s a lot of heroin overdoses. From the time I was a freshman to the time I graduated 4 years later, I knew of at least 9 people, heroin, huffing, alcohol overdose, drowning, those kind of deaths. Through my town, and so that kind of lets you know there's not a whole lot to do in town, and so that's when those kind of issues tend to pop up, and so
Wow.
it's interesting to see the conversation around addiction now
Right.
because we grew up in that
Yeah.
environment, and so it's good to see that it's more widespread of a conversation, but it's a shame that it's still a conversation.
Right. So you were dealing with that back then.
Yeah.
Yeah. So growing up, you mentioned that growing up is a significant minority
Yeah.
in terms of the numbers. And talk about that. How did that impact kind of how you've set forth? Because I want to get into some of the stuff you're doing, which
Sure.
is really cool. But
Sure.
talk about that.
Yeah, thanks, Dean. I think like the weird thing is like my elementary school was named after a black man. It was like the black educator in the county. My grandmom went to Robert Moton High School. That was a segregated high school. He was the principal. I went to Robert Moton Elementary because that was their way of preserving the legacy and history. And so it was odd that I went to elementary school named after a black man. I had a black art teacher at a young age, and so that's not a typical path for somebody that would have grown up in an area like Westminster. And so I did have some influences, but I definitely had issues with teachers not knowing how to deal with an outspoken black kid in their class, right? That's a challenging thing. They don't want their authority challenged in front of the other class or in front of the other classmates. And so I suffered several suspensions. When you hear about the statistics of how school districts suspend and expel black boys, particularly more than anyone else, that was me. I think by the time I was in middle school, I averaged about 6 or 7 suspensions a year.
Wow.
Never enough to get me expelled, but it was usually speaking out, being confrontational. I learned the word insubordination real early. It was like, you're being insubordinate, huh? What does that mean?
How'd I do that?
My mom made me look it up. She was like, you don't know what it means? Look it up in the dictionary. And so there I did.
Wow.
My mom was a major influence in me growing up, single parent. She was a social worker. And so to see other folks in the community respond to her in a way of respect and just the fact that she's being of assistance to them, whether it's parenting skills or getting access to food stamps or something. I mean, that's what my mom did, was a social worker growing up.
Wow.
And so I always joked to her about when she would try some new discipline technique on me. It's like, what magazine did you read that of this week? Like, she's always going to some conference and trying something on me or something.
Wow. You ended up at Ohio University as a student athlete.
Yeah.
And well, I want to talk about that experience, but also you were, and I don't know if you're still on the national board of the Student African American Brotherhood.
I am.
But I know you were involved with that. But talk about that and your experience in college.
Sure. So when I went to college, I knew I wanted to get a journalism degree. And Ohio University at the time had one of the top 10 journalism schools in the country. I believe it was 5 at the time. And that of all the schools that I applied to, Ohio University was the only one that rejected me. They rejected me from the School of Journalism, and so I ended up canceling. I didn't go to NC State. I didn't go to Auburn. I didn't go to Western Maryland, which is now McDaniel College. I got into all of those schools, right? Pitt as well. It was the rejection from Ohio University that I was like, nah, y'all ain't doing that. Like, so I went and went into Ohio University through the College of Communications. I think it was a visual communications degree is what I started on, but worked closely with advisors to be able to get out and get my degree in journalism, news writing, and editing in 4 years, not 5, not 6, in 4 years.
Wow.
And graduated with that degree. And so, it was kind of going to school in Athens, Appalachia. It's a very poor part of the country, but it's a college town. And so it's about 5.5, 6 hour drive from where I grew up. Different state, whole different environment, whole different culture. And so I immersed myself in that campus culture, got involved, like I said, all kinds of things. I became an RA, involved in the NAACP on campus, worked at the student newspaper as I sold ads. I didn't write for it because I was so involved on campus. There was a conflict of interest on the news side, so I got to experience advertising sales on that side, which was an interesting mix, right? A journalism guy doesn't normally do that stuff, but when you're talking about like the interesting, diverse things, again, just falling into these things. I ended up working at the student newspaper because we were running a protest against the paper for their coverage or lack of coverage of black culture on campus. And the publisher of the paper was in this town hall meeting, and I was going in on him, and then he right there in the meeting says, well, why don't you come work for us? And I was just kind of like, that diffused the situation. I didn't accept right then and there, but that's the kind of environment that when you see something like that, it's like, okay, so being quiet isn't going to serve you too well. Just keep speaking up. And there's time and time again. I mean, in college, I held an event, was president of my fraternity, the oldest historically black fraternity in the country, Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, founded in 1906. My chapter on my campus founded in 1919, right? An old historic chapter. became two-term president of the chapter, and at that time was an RA involved in so many different things on campus, and realizing that there's a black campus, there's a white campus. The two campuses didn't really mix. Like I was the go-between because I was on student senate. I was doing things where I was involved and exposed. I was the token, more or less. And so that led me to then host a program called Bridging the Gap, and it was basically bringing the leaders of Greek letter organizations, the white Greek letter organizations, the historically black Greek letter organizations, into a room for a reception to meet one another and have conversations. It was myself and another guy named James, who was in some of my journalism classes, and we were buddies anyway, and he was a president of his fraternity. It was the two of us there. That's it. No one else showed, right? And so looking back on it, that was the genesis of Coffee with the Black Guy, right? It was the same idea, the same notion, same concept of just sitting down, having conversations, and getting to know folks.
Right. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So you were a bridge builder in a sense. I mean, you were thinking that way even while you were in college.
Absolutely. And I mean, see, even looking back, I was a student athlete. Athletes don't get involved in organizations. They don't do things outside of that schedule. Right. And you know, I ran track, and a lot of the guys a lot of the folks in general that I ran track with, we all got involved on campus and did things. And it was, I guess it may have just been the era, it may have been the mix of folks on campus. But you know, that was the kind of path that we set while we were on the yard. And so, you know, again, it served me well. I didn't particularly know what you're doing then, and a lot of times when you're young, you don't know what you're stumbling through.
Right.
But you know, you just kind of stick to it, and eventually it'll work out. And in hindsight, you'll realize why the value in a lot of those things. Right. And now I can see that.
So you ended up being an award-winning journalist. I mean, so you did pursue the journalism thing.
I did.
But then you ended up in public service. To talk about, did you always have in the back of your mind that you'd end up in public service or public life in some way?
I always had in the back of my mind that I would not end up in public service or public life, right? That was always in my head. And as a journalist, I was, you know, just exploring curiosity, covering things. You know, first stories I'm covering are about tax abatements in the city of Gas City, Indiana, where the mayor is Larry Leach, and I have to interview him at the Ducktail Run, which is a classic car show. Like, come on, where am I right now, right? Like, that's what I dive into. And so seeing what I was doing in journalism, and right, you know, finding out, you know, you're looking for the conflict point. You know, find out where the friction is, and that's the story. And so you do your general coverage and your day-to-day, and you start to learn processes. You start to learn, you know, how things work, what budgets look like, when things are off, and then eventually you kind of realize that, well, I got the hang of this. I'm telling these people's story, and they're trusting me to tell their story in their community. And I'm an outsider in their community telling their story, and they're trusting me with this. And so you grow into that, but then also when you're looking at the conflict, I see what the problem is, right? And as the reporter, I see, okay, this person just needs to talk to this person. But my job is to report the story, not to make that recommendation. And so that always kind of frustrated me. It always kind of frustrated me as a journalist about this whole not getting involved, not being a joiner. When I would go to a new town, and I went to, you know, Marion, Indiana, Yakima, Washington, Toledo, Ohio, I'd get to a new town and I'd anchor into the NAACP or my fraternity members to be able to like get some grounding in the community that helps me network, that helps me get contacts. But at the same time, it exposes me to it limits my ability to connect being a journalist. It limits my ability to be a member of the NAACP as a journalist, because eventually I'm going to have to cover what they're doing.
Right. So that's a really interesting point about journalism. Find the friction.
Right.
Because that, and right now it seems like a lot of people are, you know, talking about the media a lot.
Right.
They divide us. But what you're saying is that's kind of the point. I mean, in terms of the story.
Yeah, the story narrative. Yeah. I mean, in J school, we're told that thousands of planes take off and land every day in this country, and that's not a headline. It's the one that crashes that makes the headline.
Right.
That's the story. And essentially, when you look at it that way, that is the role, right? When people are complaining about, you know, the media dividing, like the media is the fourth estate of our government, right? Like we've bailed out car companies, we've bailed out airline companies, and we've just let the fourth estate disintegrate to a shadow of what it should be and what it used to be, because the primary role is to be the watchdog of our government. And when when you just looking, here in Santa Barbara, when you look at the newsroom, the number of employees in a newsroom and how that's dwindled over the past decade and maybe even 20 years, right? It's just been, that's a travesty. We're all worse because of it. We don't have as many watchdogs out there holding folks accountable, and therefore things go unchecked, and that continues a snowball effect.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
I had not thought about that. So you're in journalism, you end up going into public service, working with a state senator. Talk about that transition and coming to California.
Sure. So in 2008, I was in Toledo, Ohio, was the education reporter in Toledo. If you remember Toledo, it was Joe the plumber in 08, right? It was battleground territory. Obama hung out in Toledo for 3 days prior to the final debate with John McCain. And so, like, I cracked that story because I was thinking about, like, okay, where in town could a bunch of people come and stay and be sequestered for a long time? And then I went to that location and I saw them doing a walk around with all the security agencies. And so that became my front page story. Obama's coming to town. It wasn't the best kind of scoop, but hey, it proved myself as a journalist in that newsroom at the time. And so that was an interesting place to be, where things are. It's a battleground city, battleground territory, right on the border of Michigan. And so seeing people coming and walk, doing precinct walking for both Obama and McCain and Sarah Palin. There was a day I was, in the press pool with Sarah Palin as she made stops in Canton, Ohio, and Columbus, Ohio. And so, being in the press pool with the traveling gaggle of craziness, and being able to see that side of things, and then getting laid off a few weeks after that. It's journalism. I told you, it's just a shadow of what it used to be. That's been the trend, and so. It was a union open shop, a guild shop, which means that there were rules. The last people in the door, the first ones out the door. I left. It was 18 degrees and 12 inches of snow on the ground, and I decided to come to Southern California. I was sick of that. So I came out to Southern California, ended up through some networks getting a job at a for-profit education institute, and then that didn't work out for me because I felt ethically wrong about it. Ended up unemployed for a couple weeks. Friend who I was running a room from in her house was the lead organizer for Cause, a social justice nonprofit. She says, a friend of mine and former co-worker who's a city councilman up in Santa Barbara needs some help with his campaign down here. He's running for state assembly. That was Das Williams. I did an interview in Starbucks. I got hired on his campaign, and the rest is history. He ended up winning. Brought me onto his staff, did his communications and field rep for him while he was in the assembly. When Senator Jackson got elected 2 years later, she stole me away, brought me to Santa Barbara to first work as her deputy district director. So just in her district leadership as she's navigating, trying to represent 1 million people. And then as her district director for the majority of the time. And it's just been a delight to work with her and learn so many things from her, see her tenacity on issues, and, to even argue with her. Those were fun, right? She's an attorney, and she doesn't always, it's not always just like asking questions nicely. She starts peppering in questions, and then sometimes I start peppering in responses and rebuts. And that's fun, right? And we both have fun and respect one another for that. But understanding how that plays into the process of making the decisions and making statements before crowds and making statements on the floor of the legislature. I mean, just seeing how all that unfolds has just been... And the difference with journalism is, when I was a journalist, I would see the problem. I'd say this person needs to talk to this person, and I'd have to report the story. Well, in public service, I see that this person needs to talk to this person, and I bring them together and have the conversation. Right. It's a much more empowering situation. But I see the natural transition into it based on my background.
Right. Well, and that leads us perfectly to the next question in terms of this initiative that you've been doing. It's called Coffee with a Black Guy. Yep. And I'm just reading about it. I thought, what a great idea. And what a especially in this time, it just seems like a great idea. So how did you get the idea, and then kind of what's your vision for it?
Sure. I'm not a genius. I stole it from law enforcement. I found out through a fraternity brother of mine that the city of Hawthorne, they started Coffee with a Cop in 2011. And I'd seen it in Oxnard, I'd seen it in Santa Barbara, I'd seen it around, Coffee with a Cop. But the concept is to humanize the badge and to be seen beyond their uniform. Okay, I get that. Something about me wants to be seen beyond this, right? Somehow it's deemed threatening. People hate it. There's animus in society against black skin. So I'm like, all right, I know how to. I understand that desire to change the narrative. Let's do something. Coffee with the black guy. And it just kind of naturally came out. I remember, probably it was 2015 or so, waking up one morning with the idea, calling one of my cousin and just like, hey man, listen to this idea. And he's like, oh man, that's a great idea. All right, I got to go to work. 2 hours later, I get a text from him. We own the domain name, coffeewiththeblackguy.com.
Oh,
nice. We had that and kind of sat dormant for about a year. Then rolls around the summer of 2016, and you have the killing of Philando Castile in Minnesota and Alton Sterling in Louisiana. The country is just reeling off of these high-profile sanctioned killings from law enforcement, right? And those are the headlines. That's what's dominating the news. Yet I'm walking around the streets in Santa Barbara, and people are avoiding eye contact with me, just acting like I'm not the black guy walking down the street and everybody else is white. Like, we know what's going on. Seems very inauthentic. And so I just decided to have black guy office hours, so to speak, right? Just pitch it out there, Coffee with the Black Guy. There's a lot of things that's going on that you may not know how to process. I've been dealing with race since I was in kindergarten, right? Not always knowing how to process it, going through that anger, but then coming through the side of seeing, okay, I can see both sides. I can understand why hate may exist, but I'd like for you to explain it to me. If you're a member of the Klan, explain to me, why is it that there's hate against me? And it's usually rooted in mythology, rooted in lack of contact and interaction. And so, not letting things emotionally rile me up and that getting in the way of being able to have a conversation and listen. It's very difficult for people to listen when your temperature's red. Right? And so just keep the temperature cool, coffee, connection, conversation.
That's genius.
Yeah.
That's genius. Listening.
Yeah.
What an idea. What a concept.
And it's perspective, right? It's building community, getting to know your neighbor. You can spin it any way you want to, but it's things we should be doing anyway.
Right.
We should be having authentic conversations. People say, I have black friends or I have black family members. It's great. What do you talk to them about? Do you talk to them about the things that you want to talk about? Or are you really allowing them to open up and creating a space to provide that real perspective so you can learn from that? There's a great value in this perspective, right? Being able to navigate this world from this lens, from seeing how people interact with this frame. It puts me, I feel, in a director's seat, right?
Right.
I walk into a room, I'm the only black guy in the room. I'm in control. I know that there's people who are either going to want to come to me because I'm the only black guy in the room or want to go away from me because I'm the only black guy in the room. I understand the lay of the land, right? And so once you kind of frame it and you look at it with that mindset, I hate to use some of these, motivational speaker terminology and stuff, but it's it's empowering to once you change the narrative and you start to look at things from a power stance, right? And it's not necessarily a supremacy power stance. It's a humble power. It's, if you look at where our country was before we had Barack Obama, our country needed this black savior, so to speak, right? If you look at, what things are unfold in our society, and then who is constantly the one healing, it's black women. Look at this past election, right? And people are like, oh, the Senate is no longer controlled by the GOP, and now whatever that means for folks, right? And so when you look at how these things unfold, Black folks have consistently stood up and showed up for America. The economic prowess of this country is based on the backs of Black folks. And until we fully recognize and really swallow that pill and address it, it's going to continue to be used against us as a point of division. I argue it's a homeland security issue. If you look at what happened in 2016 in our recent elections, and you say, oh, Russia interfered with our election, they fed false narratives. False narratives about what? Things that we haven't addressed anyway in our own country. I bet you if we sit down and really have the reconciling conversations and actions to go along with that as a country, they're not going to have anything to divide, right? And so it's not their problem, that's our problem.
Yeah, that's powerful. Great thoughts. I can't believe we're out of time, but I wanted to mention that in addition to all this other stuff that we've been talking about, Mr. Joyce is a candidate for mayor. I can see why now after talking to him for a few minutes. But powerful, great work with everything you're doing, and we commend you and applaud you. And we're looking forward to getting to know you better, and I'm sure a lot of people are.
Absolutely, and I'm looking forward to it as well. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Appreciate it. We'll see you next time.